Hello, come on in.
Hello.
Hey, some seats near the front. I'll just give people just a minute or so to join. Okay, it's a couple of minutes past, so I'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan. I'm a BA or business analyst, and I work with Herd. I wanted to say thanks very much to everyone for coming along today. I'm really looking forward to sharing a bunch of lessons learned that I've collected on this particular subject, but I built this as a discussion event, so I'm really looking forward to hearing from anything from you guys and any lessons that you've picked up as well. It is really quite cool actually that we've got a bunch of people coming together who are interested enough to talk about this subject, about big systems. So I'm looking forward to a good chat, and my aim is that by the end of the session we'll have all spoken about different lessons and shared some useful things that we can implement in our own work. So a little bit about Herd before we get started. We are we're a consultancy that does business analysis, product, and change. And the thing that we really specialize in is discovery and recovery, and that means getting things started the right way, but also getting things on track if we need to. And we work with universities and central government departments and FTSE 100 companies. And most clients that we work with come to us when they want to start something new, or when they need help getting things back on track, or often if they're looking to, if they're looking to grow their in-house capabilities around business analysis or product, for example. Now, before I started working at Herd, I worked for one of the really big, really old English universities, and it still is a really complex and interesting place with lots of chewy challenges. And my most recent role there was as lead BA on a big HR and payroll transformation program. Now, part of that program involved procuring and designing and configuring a new HR and payroll system to replace the old system and all of the smaller homemade systems that were used to deliver HR. Now, I learned loads from that program because it was super intense. And even though it was one of the best run programs I've ever worked on, and it had lots of really experienced people on it, it was just really difficult. It seemed that getting the new system in was by its nature something that was just difficult and complex, especially I think in a highly devolved organization. And since then, since that experience, I've become like a bit obsessed with the idea of how difficult it is. I feel like there are some like really high profile examples of big system implementations that don't go great everywhere I look. That might be because I'm a bit obsessed with the subject, but I think if you just do any reading online or talk to people about it, it will come up. In fact, it does come up at most conferences I go to or chats I have with people that are doing it. So again, what I've done today is I brought together some of the lessons learned that I've picked up from my own experience, and I've been able to see them validated either in case studies that have been published about those big sort of headline grabbing examples, or in just chats I've had or articles I've read. So the idea is to share them here, and I hope that they'll be useful. And also, like I said earlier, there's an opportunity for us to sort of chat around them, and to also, I guess, to connect with them as well and continue the chat offline. Like I said, enough people have joined that are interested in talking about implementing big systems on a Tuesday morning. I think that there's potential for us to engage with people that we can continue to talk about this. Now, to set a bit of context, when I say big systems, I'm talking about is enterprise resource planning systems. So some people call them ERPs. They're often like HR systems. They do payroll or finance, and sometimes they do other stuff like customer relationship management or case management. And for me, and again, this might be skewed because of my obsession with the subject, but they do seem to be everywhere at the moment. And I think the big trend, at least in higher education, which is my background, is to move to the cloud-based software as a service versions of those systems. And like I said, if you speak to anyone, they'll tell you it's difficult, and they also cost quite a lot of money. And here's a slide with some big numbers on it. scary numbers, and you can tell it's scary because it's got the word catastrophic on it. And this is a stat that I've seen used in a few different sessions on this subject, and I'm kind of just using it as shorthand for the vibe that you will get if you go online and start reading about what it's like to implement ERPs. This particular stat needs quite a lot to unpick, because it's actually saying that the failure is them failing to meet their original business goals. And you might want to wonder, like, well, what does fail catastrophically mean? It's worth reading. It's from one of the big consultancies, but I'm just using it here just to share and to sort of validate the vibe that it is difficult. They do go wrong, and some of them go wrong really badly. So if it's really difficult, and if loads of them go wrong, and some of them go wrong badly, and it's really expensive, why do people do it? So I think there are good reasons and bad reasons, and it's worth us remembering that while we're going through these different lessons learned. And I think the good reasons, when they're really thought through, make sense. So you can, if you do it properly, and you do a good process design and you work with stakeholders, you can streamline your operations. So you can get better efficiency if you're using a good new system and you implement it well and you configure it well. Similarly, you can do cool stuff like surface data that you might not have been able to surface before. So if you had like offline processes, or processes with a tool that's maybe outdated and was designed before the importance of data was like truly realized, then you might be able to start surfacing that data, which means you can get actionable insights, which means you can use that to make better decisions. And finally, you can do cooler stuff like automating parts of your processes. And that's something that people are really keen to do. And if done right, and you're not automating bad parts of processes, then you can do really cool stuff like free people's resource up to do more value add stuff. So think less copying and pasting from spreadsheets in your process, and more time freed up for people to give specialist HR advice. The bad reasons are the ones that I think you might come across more often just in conversation, and really they just generally fit under silver bullet thinking, which is this shiny new thing will fix all of my problems, even if I just plonk it on top of broken processes, or sometimes I don't know, like the need for staff training, or maybe like digital competency issues. Finally, as well, I think one of the other bad examples that goes along with silver bullet thinking is overestimating the benefits, and thinking, for example, that you get like a massive return on investment straight away, or that it will be like big savings, when sometimes that's often not the case, or at least not in the short term. So talked a bit about what I mean when I say big systems. And for good reasons or bad reasons, we know people implement them, and we know that it's difficult. So these are the three themes that I wanted to talk about today. I've got sort of lessons learned or just reflections on each of them, and they are scope and change management, resource and effort. Now, I was going to talk about processes, but as I was putting this together, I realized that I had quite a lot to say about processes. It was one of my main focuses on the program that I was working on. And I think it would just be more sensible to have a separate talk on that. So if anyone's interested in that, please let me know in the chat, and I can sort of gauge that and see about putting on a separate talk about processes in the context of getting your processes correct and harmonizing them through. And harmonizing them, getting people on the same page, and realizing that actually most of your processes are similar and there are just a few different differences. So I am going to move on to start talking about each of these, but I did mention I do want to hear from you guys. I don't want it to just be me talking. So I will, at the end of each of the little sections, I'll stop and pause and ask people if you've got any like comments or thoughts. Please, though, feel free to just have a chat, have a natter in the chat alongside. So if I say something, don't like wait. There are a bunch of people here who want to talk about this. So feel free to talk with each other. I'll catch up on the chat later. I've got my colleagues from Herder here as well, and I might call out that's something particularly interesting. I really do want to hear from you guys, because I am interested in the subject and I want to learn more. So the first lesson, and I've put some of these just in the quick, catchy lessons that stick in my head at least, is around scope. And the lesson is that if you don't define it, your stakeholders will, and they'll do it in their heads without telling you. And then when they find out that the scope isn't what they thought it is, they'll be mad at you about it. And I remember a really challenging part of scoping on the program that I was working on, way in the sort of misty beginnings of the program, when we were still figuring out what the scope was. There was a real temptation for us to communicate in like really stripped back, digestible terms. Like we don't want to overcomplicate it. We're transforming HR and payroll, is what we would say. We'd say like, hey, that's what we're going to do. We're going to transform HR and payroll. We're figuring it out. We like just wait, and we'll get some more scope around it. And what we found was, or what I noticed in particular, was that some people were just interpreting that in wildly different ways. And because it was early on in the program, there weren't yet channels for easy engagement. And that meant that we didn't have that sort of two-way communications. And so we didn't find out what assumptions people were making until later on. And the image that I had in my head is they were sort of like carrying them around like Jack in the Boxes, like winding that handle. And then every now and then they just pop out with one of these assumptions that we hadn't realized had embedded it. And the example I can think of specifically, and this is going to be a bit niche to universities, but I think you'd encounter it in most organizations really, is around grading. And I don't mean like marking of papers. I mean like banding of a role. So a method by which, or a system by which, someone's role profile is assessed for like the different competencies and responsibilities they have, and then their pay grade is determined. That's a super emotive subject in any organization because it's about money, it's about how people feel about their worth, it's about how they compare themselves to their colleagues. And when we said we're transforming HR and payroll, a lot of people heard we're transforming grading because that was the main thing that was in their mind. They had some people had grievances about it, some people thought it needed fixing, it was overcomplicated. And because we didn't explicitly say it wasn't in scope, that's what they went to straight away. And so they got their hopes up, they started making assumptions, they started talking to their colleagues about it. And then we found that we had to do quite a bit of sort of change management work with people who felt that we'd rode back on something that we'd said that we were going to do. And they were disappointed by it right from the get-go. And we never said that we were going to do it, but they heard us say it because I think perhaps we didn't use the right words and we were communicating that scope early on. So before I open up to any thoughts or comments, just some other quick points about scope. I think if it's too broad, this is really just from my reading and conversations with people. If it's too broad, you might bite off more than you can chew. There's that challenge. You might end up overstretching resources, and including governance groups. They might get too stretched and strained and not be able to keep track of what's happening. And also timelines reflect that. If you've got a super long scope and it's like 3 years, think about how much has changed in the last 3 years. Your needs might completely change, and you might just plumb forget why you started and what the reasons were, especially if you've got turnover of staff. If the scope's too narrow, then you can either be under ambitious in what you're trying to do and miss an opportunity to make some real change, or it's falsely narrow. If you start off with it's too narrow, it's falsely narrow, you get agreement for a certain amount of funding, and then you realize, oh, whoops, we're gonna have to put through loads and loads of change requests, and that will spiral, and that will be a negative experience for people. Also, just a general tip, I'm sort of just throwing this out there, but if you say you're going to replace like legacy systems, especially homemade systems, make sure you know them inside out before you say that, because often they'll be homemade, they'll be sort of customized and tailored for an organization or a small group in an organization. People will be emotionally attached to them, and if you say you're going to be replacing it, you really need to make sure that you do it definitely properly, right? Otherwise people get disappointed and you'll be making a lot for your own back. And then finally, and this needs quite a bit of unpacking, but I did want to put it in there, don't be too rigid with it. Change will happen. The program manager that I worked on with this sort of dropped pearls of wisdom pretty much every day. And one of them was like, change happens. Like, it's program management is about controlling that and making sure that you mitigate it. And so if changes are happening, if you realize there's a change request that needs discussing, just look it in the face, like understand it, understand the cost of it, the benefits of it, and then make sure you've got a clear change management structure, because otherwise people will sort of delay, or they'll pretend it's not happening, or they'll want to sort of put, good money after bad and avoid it. And there are all sorts of, there be dragons that way. So right, those are just some quick fire lessons on top of the other one about scope. But I will stop talking because I want to hear what you guys have to say. So I haven't been able to keep an eye on the chat, but if anyone's put anything in the chat that they want to come off mic to talk about, or if anything comes to mind now about anything that I've said, I'd love to hear about it. Don't be shy. Sophie, I can see your hand's gone up.
Hi. Yeah, I was just I was really curious just to hear what you were mentioning there in terms of like managing scope and potentially like, especially I really resonated with what you were talking about in terms of like being able to keep these kind of systems flexible, because obviously, like you say, when you're implementing them, so many things can come up that like you might not have even precedented when you were in the planning process.
Yeah.
Just really curious to hear sort of more about what your thoughts are in terms of managing that flexibility and like managing feedback from people like in that process.
Yeah. That's a great shout. I've got a couple of points later on actually about engagement in the change management section, because I think that feedback from people is like really important. Let me think on it. I'll come back to it definitely. It's a really good shout. I mean, even if it's like just a chat that we have offline, like I'm happy to just have
definitely.
That'd be wicked. I think
Thanks.
in general though, I think it sounds like you and I are on the same page, and that you need to keep your ears open for that sort of thing, because sometimes priorities might change. And I think as long as the decision is made within the proper governance, sounds very dry as an answer, but it needs to be sensible. Like, as long as we know why we're making the decision, I think changing direction or changing scope, like I said about the rigidity, is something that you need to allow to happen. Thank you. I can't see who's got their hand up next. Can any of the herd guys help me out?
Go over to Chris Harton up next.
Hello, Chris.
Hi there. Hi, Dan. Yeah, so interesting on the bits about scope. Definitely something I hadn't thought about before is, and you mentioned it there, is quite interesting about the emotional attachment to legacy systems. In my experience, when I worked for a public sector body, we went through a big change process whereby we were implementing a completely new database for a highly technical discipline, and the team responsible for creating that database in-house, outlaid a great scope, and we felt really confident about it. But actually, as we went through it, realized that scope had been defined with a lot of senior leaders, and actually the guys on the ground had no input whatsoever. So the people that those senior leaders still use that database, but in a completely different way to the end user.
Okay.
And actually what ended up happening was that the scope was way too narrow. The future system wasn't going to include any of those bits that people liked, and it was just too rigid to change. And despite the fact that we went at it for 18 months, it ended up just getting mothballed, and we never changed it. So it was a really long, drawn-out process that involved a lot of user testing, a lot of feedback that ultimately culminated in nothing, just a lot of wasted time and money. And I think the key takeaway was actually that although the team responsible for creating that were IT based, they had project managers and everything like that, there wasn't actually anyone on the other side of the fence, on our side of the fence, managing that as a project. So there wasn't anyone managing that change internally for us. So just thought it was quite interesting that although you can have someone at the business end managing that, you might have all the right people, the change people, people defining the scope of the project. If you don't have anyone internally with the end user also doing that and understanding what that looks like based on their legacy system, it might also come unstuck for completely different reasons.
It's a great shout, thank you. I've written all of that down. I might follow up with you afterwards, if that's all right, to get some more info on that. Thank you. That's really useful. That's exactly what I wanted out of this, by the way, is like extra lessons learned from sort of real life experience. Have we got any other hands up in the chat? No, it doesn't look like it.
I've got no more hands.
Go on, Jamie.
I've got no more hands up. We have got some comments in the chat.
Okay,
so
cool.
we've got the first one from Matt Bentley, which is around learning about legacy systems is a big challenge. Given a lot of benefits may come from removing it, how would you go about quickly knowing them? I think it's meant to say. Yeah,
I think so. I remember I brought this whole thing up as a topic at UK. What was it called? What was the conference that we went to, Jamie? Can't remember what it was called.
UK EduCamp.
Thank you, UK EduCamp. Thank you, which is a higher ed specific tech unconference. It's really cool, and there were a couple of architects there of IT architects, and they were really talking about the importance. I mean, of course, right, because they are architects, but they were talking about the importance of architecture, system architecture, and having a clear view of what all of the systems in your organization are and what capabilities support and what they support and what they do and who the owners are. And I think if we had something a bit more like that when we started the program, we would have done a better job of understanding it. So I mean, I know that's not a great answer because it's like have something in place already to understand it. I think that what we did for the systems that we didn't have a lot of information for is that we just found out who their main users were. You just have to talk to them. I know that sounds like really basic, but talk to them and just ask them sort of open-ended questions like, what do you do with the system? What does it support? What do you achieve with it? What are the outcomes that you want from the system? Because otherwise people will start, if you ask them what does it do, they'll give you an endless list of features. But if you talk about what the outcomes are, then you get a better idea about what they're trying to achieve. And that can help you when it comes to figuring out how to replace it. I mean, there is no getting away from the fact, though, I don't think, in my experience, that the biggest challenge is that people really like these things because they fit them like a glove. I am going to move on. I'm glad to hear that there's engagement, but I've got a couple of other points to go for. Unless there's anything super urgent in the chat, I'll move on to the next one. But please do. I'm sorry to have to cut it short. It's I'm just thinking about the other content. So this next point is about change management, and I hope to hear more from you guys on this one. And this is the big one. It came up again and again out of all of my experience and reading and conversations. And I think if I had to just make the presentation a single slide, it would just be about change. Even though I'm not a change manager, I think everyone has a part to play in change management on a program like this. I was in a session recently about people-led change the other day, and there was a change manager who another big old university, and he was saying that every single program that he's on, he asks for 2 hours from the most senior sponsors, and he speaks to them and asks them to tell him in their own words, just in a casual conversation, what it is they're most excited about the change that's happening and what benefits they see is coming from it and how they see it affecting people. He does that because he wants to take an authentic view from those people, and he uses that for comms. And so the lesson that I've got here is that change management has to be authentic. If it's not, it won't work properly. And again, people will be mad at you about it. And I think that authenticity is really fundamental, because in my experience, and I'd love to hear from yours, but I think that people just won't buy in. They just won't buy it if they can see that someone's going through the motions and it doesn't feel authentic. And if they don't buy in, they're less likely to engage. And if they don't engage, then they just won't, they'll just feel like change is being done to them because they won't have had a hand in shaping it. And if they feel like change is being done to them, they'll end up with a negative experience. You'll end up with pushback and resistance. And you might even end up with just non-compliance and non-adoption. And then we're getting into that scary, 70% of projects failing area. And I think along with authenticity, there needs to be engagement, right? And I think that engagement in what I'm thinking about here is actually more like what you were talking about, Sophie, earlier. I don't just mean people reading emails that you send out to them, or even coming to demos, or even coming along to workshops and helping you design processes. I'm talking about that sort of voluntary, organic engagement where people ask questions and share their concerns honestly and openly with you, because it's those sort of micro feedbacks that help you set your alignment in the direction that you're going in. How often can you think of a session that you've been in, hopefully not this one, where right at everything's packed in and right at the end you've got 5 minutes for questions, and it's a huge audience. Let's say they do a big demo of a new system and they say, okay, anyone got any questions? And I think in general people are shy to put their hands up at things like this anyway. And if it's a really big transformation program, then they'll be even more shy. And for the people that aren't shy, they might just be thinking, well, this audience is massive. My point is just way too niche about this. And I think you can say to people, don't hesitate to get in touch with us by email or offline as long as you want. But as soon as that session finishes, they're going back to their infinite inbox and people walking up to their desks or pinging them on Teams, and they just don't have the time or the will to get in touch. And I think those two things, getting authenticity and engagement, are a big challenge. And at the university that I worked at, I think those challenges were quite well addressed by the introduction of a role called the Change Implementation Coordinator. They were just affectionately called IMPs, and they sort of wore that badge with pride. And these were people that, wherever possible, and I think this is crucial, were seconded from or hired from, where secondments weren't possible, from the business itself, And that meant that they knew their stuff, they knew the subject matter, but also people knew they knew their stuff because they knew them. They had that personal connection to them. They were sort of well-liked and well-respected people. And that brought the authenticity. They were visible and available and contactable, so that allowed the engagement. And it meant that I might do a session and I might finish and say, any thoughts? And people just wouldn't really want to tell me that stuff. And they might also see me, because I wasn't necessarily from, let's say, HR, they might not see me as like an authentic contact point. But it meant that with the imps in place, people had the sort of vision and leadership message coming through to them. But then they also had the message of the people like on the ground. And Chris, earlier on, you mentioned the importance of that. And I think that helped to deliver both that authenticity and opened up the engagement, because people could return to these people that they already knew. They're my lessons on change management. Again, I'm going to open it up. Did that spark anything in the chat? Did that spark any thoughts with you guys? Any thoughts or advice around that? Any hands going up? Sarah, go for it. Thank you. You are muted, Sarah, if you're talking.
Hello.
Yeah,
Sorry.
hello.
So I do actually work in change management, so I'm quite interested to hear some of your lessons learned. I think, you know, what you've said there about engagement being key. And as someone who implements change, I sort of do find that getting everyone onto a call, having a weekly discussion, walking through your plan and going through the steps. I am interested to hear, though, with your systems, is it third-party systems that you tend to sort of integrate, and how does that work out? Because from my point of view, we can have quite a few challenges when you're dealing with that third party. And going back to what you were saying before about the scope and things, if you're not asking the right questions up front, it can be us that's in the dark a little bit when you know, we're not expecting certain things to be delivered, and that can be quite hard, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in this instance, we were implementing a third-party off-the-shelf system, and again, one of the challenges there is that meant the replacement of some homemade systems that people were really quite used to, and maybe had more of a hand and more of a rein in customizing. I think one of the key parts was that we worked with implementation partners, so or SIs sometimes they're called, and those guys were experts in implementing that particular tool, so they knew the tool inside out and they knew its functionality and its features. And we really did a lot, especially the program manager, to create a one-team environment, which meant that the experts on the system sort of felt like they were internal, even though they were externals, and that allowed people to be able to ask questions about it. But yes, I think you're right. It can be difficult if the knowledge of the system isn't there on the team. It can be difficult to answer people's questions and set people's expectations about it. So I guess the nugget that I'd have there is really work to create that one team environment and sort of embed any sort of system implementation partners that you've got inside the team. Thank you. It's good questions. Good to have a change manager here as well.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other points on that, or any other? Alex, I saw your hand go up and then back down again, but I'll let it stay down. James, your hand's going up.
Hello. So that my experience, like change management and things like that, is you've just got to think about people at all sorts of different levels in terms of how that big program of work might affect them. Because I tend to find that sort of the program team, the kind of SMEs, that kind of group of people are really close to the change management. When you get down in sort of my environment, I work in sort of manufacturing and down onto like factory floor, that guy who's using that system who might just do one or two small things, it's really important that you also include a comms plan, a change plan for those type of people that are not necessarily in it, but are going to be affected and are going to need supporting. So it's about making sure that your change management plan talks to everybody in an organisation.
That's really useful. Thank you. Yeah, great shout, because there are so many different levels of people in there. Thank you. And I guess, Sarah, you probably nodding along to that with your change experience as well. Sophie?
Yeah, I was just wanting to add on to what James has just said there. I do think, I think trust, is a really big part of the process as well. In the previous organisation that I worked in, we had quite a big system update that the department I worked in had quite a robust system set up for the way that our team worked. So we engaged with it really, really well, but a lot of the other team members in other departments really struggled to engage with it because of that reason, James. Like, because we had like a system that really worked for our processes. So for us, it was really easy to use. And so we had a really good uptake for it. But nearly every other department in the organization really, really struggled with it because like it wasn't set up for their team. It didn't work with their processes. And I think it's really difficult. I think it's that challenge of finding something that's universal enough that it keeps the rough structure, so it's consistent for everyone, but also gives people that tailorability and makes them feel like they're being listened to as well. Because like you say, James, like if you're somebody who has to work with that, but you don't feel like you've had any input into it, you've just been told to use it. That I think that's where sometimes the challenge can arise, because you don't feel like you've been sufficiently trained with it, but then you also like aren't sure how to make it work for you as well. Like,
go for it, James. Go for it.
Just on that as well, is that I always find as well sometimes talking to people and using the reasons why, because when you're implementing an ERP, quite often you actually introduce steps that are not there in their current process. And if you can crack that kind of like motivating factor for doing something, and just explain in sort of plain, simple terms, you know, you've got to kind of treat people with that, like you say, is that authenticity, is basically to respect what they do, and also to just empower them by telling them, informing them sort of the reasons. Yes,
definitely. Thank you. I'm gonna press on. I knew that I could have done a whole session on this about change management and that people would be interested enough about it. Keep chatting in the chat if you want to carry that on. I don't want to shut down any conversations. But I'll move on, because I think one of my colleagues, Matt, joked that everyone should prepare themselves for lots of analogies in this session, because that's sort of my first language. I think actually English is my second language and analogies is my first. And so I wanted to share one that I found really useful when talking to people about this, about implementing a big system, especially replacing a system. And it's not the most crazy, it's not like the most inventive analogy, but it is one that is useful and it's tried and tested. So I'm sort of sharing it here in case you guys want to take it or run with it or help me expand it. And at first I would think that it's like moving house, right? So everyone knows it's stressful, everyone knows it's difficult, but then there's other things to it, right? You shouldn't take bad stuff with you. Like when you're moving house, you shouldn't, if you've got time, you shouldn't take all of your rubbish with you. You should have a clear up first, and then you move the stuff that you want to into the new house. Obviously, in systems terms, we're talking about bad processes, stuff that you don't need to be doing anymore. Similarly, the place might be bigger and better than the new place, but it might not have the nooks and crannies for all your old stuff. Like you might have actually really liked your old dishwasher at your old house, but there's no space for it in the new place, right? And I equate that to like, you know, quite cool, maybe customized functionality that your old systems can do that your new system can't do. You just have to realize that actually it's a trade-off, and you get more good stuff than bad stuff. And you might just miss old parts of your old house and neighborhood. And then there's the people aspect of the house move. And some people are like super happy to move. They're like, yes, finally, my room was tiny. It was like a Harry Potter cupboard under the stairs, like it was leaking and cold. And I'm going to get like a brand new room. This is brilliant. Those are the people that are like pushing for the new system because their tools aren't working for them. Or you get the people in the middle that are never really there anyway. If you think about like the teenagers that never spend any time at home, like they're not really going to engage, but they're going to be in a new system, but then they're not really fast. And then you've got the people that are super dragging their feet. They don't want to move. They really like the old house. They had the best room. It was like made for them, in fact. And maybe they don't realize how miserable it was in the house for the other people, or maybe how much it kept to run, or that the energy efficiency was terrible and it cost loads of money to run. Now, the more I thought about that and the more I spoke to people about it, I realized actually it's a bit less like moving house, and it's more like moving an entire block of flats into a new block of flats that you have to build for them. And that's because people-wise, they're not a family. They're a bunch of people that don't really have that much in common, except for the fact that they live in the same block of flats. And they all need to move into the same block, and they all need to have all of their needs met. And it's tense. And I think you need to prepare yourself. I guess a tip that I would go back in time and tell myself is, when you start talking to people about this move, and you start talking to them about how they live in their flat or how they deliver HR and payroll, you're going to find problems, because just talking to them about this stuff flushes the information out. And you might find things like, you might find out that a particular department is doing things in a way that risks non-compliance, or you might find out that someone didn't realize that the tool that they're using already can do this cool stuff. So set some time of contingency aside for dealing with those sorts of things. And I will step away from the analogy in a second. I'm keeping an eye on time. I think the analogy is really useful because there are a few other threads to it. So if once you get that analogy embedded, you can start like adding detail, and you can start thinking about, well, the building of the new place is really useful as an analogy for building the new system, or the integrations that are needed. This new place needs to be hooked up to what? To electricity, to water, to the internet, just like the new system needs to be hooked up to other data sources that are needed to carry out the work, like maybe the LMS, for example, or the student information system. And it's also really useful for talking about, especially for people who aren't used to the concept of software as a service, and the concept of adopt, not adapt. The idea that you can decorate the flats however you want to. You can like put wallpaper up or paint it or hard floor carpet, but you can't put a swimming pool in your living room. It's going to like wreck the flat below or the flat above. Like, you can't make massive customized changes to it. So I will back away now. I just want to share it just really quickly. See if it sparks any other ideas. Keeping an eye on time, I'm going to press on to the next subject. Please put any ideas for analogies in the chat, because I do love them. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to skip the audience participation just for that one. The last point I want to talk about is resource and effort. And I think that it might seem obvious, but my lesson is, don't underestimate it. Because again, if you do, people will get mad, right? Or they'll go mad, right? And I mean that like with a bit of a serious point as well, because it might seem obvious, but unless you've just got a spare implementation team lying around, you are not going to have the resources that you need to do a big implementation in-house. I think it would be rare if you did have that. There needs to be a mix of people. You're going to want to have internal people from the business, acting as subject matter experts and guiding the configuration and guiding the design of the way the system works. You will need them. That's important for that trust and that authenticity that we talked about. But then you are also going to need people that know the technical expertise of the new tool, that know it inside out, and that have implemented it elsewhere. And there can be, I've read about and I've spoken to people about, it was less the case where I was working. There can be a sense of pride in amongst the tech resources that, like, oh, we don't need someone to come in and tell us how to do this. We know that we can do integrations, or we can do this and that. So there's a bit of that to get past. I think you need the balance, because the assumption is the internal people know the business really well, but they don't know the tool really well, and vice versa. The implementation partners that you get in might know the tool well, and they might even know the sector, but they won't know your organization really well. You need that balance. And I think the important thing about the internal thing is that where possible, you should be, I think the best practice is you should be seconding people onto the program, rather than giving it to them on top of their day job, which is already slammed, because you're not going to get results that way. And anyone that deals with HR or has anything to do with HR will now see in their mind an infinite link of backfills, right, and secondments when that happens. But it's worth it. That's the pain, that's the cost, but it's worth it, because it means you get proper engagement from those people. You get their expertise applied, and you also get the benefits of, those development opportunities for people backfilling the chain. It might be that the head of the contracts team, let's say, that you decide to second, their deputy gets a chance to see what it's like being the head for a while, and then they can develop their own career. I think the last point, and I'm sort of speeding up a bit here looking at time, is that you need to support those people to engage. Once you've seconded someone onto a work, they need to leave their old work behind, especially if you're seconding them full time. Now, they might not want to. There's that aspect of it. It might be their baby. They don't want to leave it behind. They don't trust people. They need to learn, how to delegate. That's like an HR issue. But they might also not be allowed to by their team. Their team might keep paying them. They might keep pulling them into meetings. And you need to do what you can to support those people. Because, again, a lot of the reading that I've done, I've seen that, and like personally, I've seen that burnout is a real issue. Because if you don't get this resource balance right, you risk poor delivery, but you also risk people burning out. In fact, the University of Edinburgh's implementation of an ERP is a headline-making one for being particularly tricky. They're really doing a lot to work their way through it and have been very public about how they're doing it. But one of their points is, in one of the reports that they did, don't underestimate resource to try and fit a budget, because you will just end up doing it badly and people will burn out. And I think well-being can sometimes be seen as a bit of a fluffy thing or a nice to have, but I think people are realizing more and more how important it is, not just because of the valid human reasons, but because of the brass tacks business reasons. If people are burnt out, they won't perform properly, or they might leave, or they might not be able to work because they're too sick. And what that means is you lose their skill, you lose their memory of what's happened so far in the program, you lose the credit and the trust and the authenticity that people have built up, that they've built up all along. And that in turn risks buy-in from the stakeholders, and then we're back around to change management again. So I think all of this links together. And rather than ending on a negative note on that, I think a way to mitigate against that is something that was really tried to be done in the program I was on, which is to create a team environment where it's okay to talk about burnout and you can vent and you can ask for help. That's a minimum, I think. I think really the best thing to do is to plan resources so that you don't get burnout. There's no getting away from the fact that something's difficult, but you can still help each other and protect each other. I'll open up then for a last, this is just a sum up, I'll skip past this. Internal resource, you need it. External resource, you need it. You need a balance between the two, and you need to look after people. I think I just saw Matt in the chat say that that's an absolute must, and I agree. So last all ears. I do realize we're at time, but I'm done with my content. I do want to hear from you, so I'm happy to stay on if anyone wants to chat. Alex, I think I've seen your hand go up.
Yeah, hi Dan.
Hey.
Do you get a sense that when resource is kind of lacking in certain areas, and you're obviously struggling there with budget as well, do you get a sense that there are certain areas that get missed off that are actually seen by business owners as being kind of as not important, when in actual fact they are actually super important? I'm thinking stuff like discovery here and that type of work, in the sense that people actually are so intent about buying the system and going off and doing that, when in actual fact they don't actually understand what the problem is and what the issues are. And so I just didn't know from your experience whether what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Given an opportunity to talk about that, I will go on about it. But I think you're definitely right. The stuff that you said, definitely. So I'm a BA, and I think BA, that happens to BA, because I think a gripe that sometimes BAs have is that people think that we are just like the outputs that we make. I think people are tempted sometimes to say, let's not look at the as is, let's not spend time mapping the as is, because we're not going that way. And that is, I think, a mistake, because without as is, you can't get baselines, you can't therefore evidence benefits, you can't easily track change. That's one example, I think. Discovery is definitely another one. I can't think of much more. Change management is one. Luckily, on the program that I was on, it was definitely seen as really important. I think anything that doesn't seem to be tech related, people seem to try and cut at their peril. I think definitely good shout. Thank you. Any other thoughts from anyone else, or anything interesting popping up in the chat heard, guys?
I think there's a lot in the chat there, actually. It's been a really engaging session, so thank you to everyone who's popped in thoughts, questions, feedback. I think what we probably should do is, rather than trying to rush it in a few seconds or a couple of minutes, let's take these questions away, and we can come back to people where they are questions and where their thoughts and comments, if it's relevant, we can come back to you, so we can export those and get back in touch with the email addresses that you signed up to. So thank you for the engagement. It seems like a really popular topic, and thank you, Dan, as well, for sharing your experiences. I think Sarah may have popped a hand up. We can probably take one more question if people want to stay on.
I'm happy to stay on for people, by the way. I know it was billed at 45 minutes. I have completely fulfilled my own prophecy of saying any questions at the end and allowing people a minute.
Sorry, that was totally my mistake.
No worries, it's cool.
Pressed the wrong button. Sorry, guys.
No worries, it's cool. I'm going to take it that you meant to clap. I'll just take the praise. That's fine. So let me just finish off just by saying just thank you. That was for me. It was really interesting. I was a bit nervous at first, but you guys are like really welcoming, so it was great to just chat through. Get in touch. Like, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'm always up for a chat about this stuff, even if it's just an informal thing. There's my thing, Dan. So on LinkedIn, I'm Dan_PA. Otherwise, yeah, get in touch with us if you're interested in working with us and Heard. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
See ya. Bye, guys.
Bye.